Welcome, everyone, to our July 3rd Thursday, Outside the Box, Writing in More Than One Genre or Category. I'm Sarah Renee Beach, the program director here at the Writers League of Texas. Thank you all for being here tonight. Welcome also to those of you tuning in on YouTube. We're joined tonight by a really stellar panel. You all are in for such a treat. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and then we will dive into a conversation. Our first panelist is Nick Flynn. Nick Flynn, writer, playwright, poet, has published 12 books, most recently Low, a poetry collection, This is the Night Our House Will Catch Fire, a hybrid memoir, and Stay, Threads, Collaborations, and Conversations, which documents 25 years of his collaborations with artists, filmmakers, and composers. He has been awarded fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the Library of Congress and is on the creative writing faculty at the University of Houston. His acclaimed memoir, Another Bullshit Night in Suck City, was made into a film starring Robert De Niro and has been translated into 15 languages. Welcome, Nick. We're so excited to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to be here. Thanks.
And our next panelist is Courtney Maum. Courtney Maum is the author of 5 books, including the groundbreaking publishing guide that Vanity Fair recently named one of the 10 best books for writers, before and after the book deal, and the memoir, The Year of the Horses, chosen by the Today Show as the best read for mental health awareness. A writing coach, director of the writing workshop Turning Points, and educator, Courtney's mission is to help people hold on to the joy of art making and a culture obsessed with turning artists into brands. Passionate about literary citizenship, Courtney sits on the advisory councils of the Authors Guild and the Rumpus and runs a best-selling Substack on publishing conundrums. You can sign up for her weekly newsletter and online masterclasses at CourtneyMaum.com. Courtney, we're so excited that you're here. Thank you so much for being here.
It's so nice to see you all again. Hi, thank you for having me.
Reyes Ramirez is a Houstonian writer, educator, curator, and organizer of Mexican and Salvadoran descent. He authored the short story collection The Book of Wonders, a 2023 Young Lions Fiction Award finalist from University of Arizona Press's Camino del Sol series, and the poetry collection El Rey of Gold Teeth from Hub City Press, a finalist for the 2024 Texas Institute of Letters Award for Best First Book of Poetry. His latest curatorial project, The Houston Artist Speaks Through Grids, explores the use of grids in contemporary Houston art, literature, history, and politics. Reyes has been honored as a 2020 Cantomundo Fellow, 2021 Interchange Artist Grant Fellow, 2022 Crosstown Arts Writer in Residence, 2023 Intercultural Leadership Institute Fellow, 2023 Dobie Paisano Fellow, 2024 Speculative Play and Just Futuratives Fellow, and has been awarded grants from the Houston Arts Alliance, Poets and Writers, and the Warhol Foundation's Idea Fund. Reyes, we are so thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So like I said, amazing panel we have here. And there's so much I want to cover with you all on this topic. So I really just want to dive in. I do want to let our audience know that you're welcome to submit questions to us also. Please put them, there's a Q&A box here on Zoom. On YouTube, you can drop them in the comments. And Evan will get them to me. Thank you, Evan, for helping us out with the YouTube live stream. And we'll take some time towards the end of the program to get some audience questions answered. But first, I get to ask questions, which is exciting. Let's start with the beginning of your writing lives. What was the genre that first brought you to the world of creative writing? Is that the genre that you first published in? Was it a linear path? Or were you experimenting with multiple genres from the start of your writing career? And Reyes, I'd love to start with you if that's okay.
Sure thing. Yeah. First of all, thanks again for having me here, and happy to share the space with you all. But for me, my first genre, I guess, was poetry. As someone who's always had to navigate different languages, in terms of English and Spanish and Spanglish and navigating America. I think inherently having to translate nearly everything in your head in a way is a form of poetry that I think that just happens. And so when I was finally putting it, to paper, it was actually as a gift from my mom, and it was like the worst poem I've ever written. But it got me to where I am now. And as time went on around, and this is around like high school, and as I got into more into, I first actually started in journalism. So I then started writing like news pieces. And then I kind of got into more of like the narrative form of writing that led me to short stories. And then once I kind of mastered my own sense of the short story and played more and more with poetry, that's when I think I ventured more into nonfiction in terms of like as a creative practice. Again, I'd already started writing like journalistic pieces and features. And as I did more research into that, I then found that like a lot of writers that I loved and respected started in journalism. They started, so like Gabriel Garcia Marquez started in journalism. And he actually had this quote that really illuminated things for me, where he said, if you were to just tell a group of people there's a bunch of elephants flying outside, they're not going to believe you. But if you said there's 11 elephants flying outside, they're going to be more willing to check. And so I think kind of when you play with the truth and stuff like that, that's when you command people's attention. But then like Maya Angelou, Edgar Allan Poe, these are all like journalists. They start out as journalists. And so for me, that then segued into kind of, much more avenues of play with language. And it always never really made sense to me to kind of stick to one genre or mode, so to speak. I think in the great expanse of language and forms, to limit yourself to just like only poetry or to only fiction or to only one thing, I think kind of doesn't make sense to me. It's almost like, language behooves you to play with it in all its forms. And so, I don't know if that answers your question completely, but yeah, that'll be the short answer version of that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you. Nick, what about you?
Yeah, I was thinking, when I was first writing, it was when I was a kid. I was very young, and I was writing what I was reading. Like I'd read books, and so when I was 12, I was reading a lot of Sherlock Holmes, and so I tried to write a Sherlock Holmes story. I tried to write, but one thing that I thought for some reason, I thought that you should write collaboratively. So I wrote it with a friend. I convinced a friend that we should spend the entire summer when we were 12 writing a story like Sherlock Holmes. And then like a few years later, I was reading Kurt Vonnegut. I was like, 15, and I convinced another friend we should write like a science fiction story. Like so the collaboration aspect of it, which is kind of odd for writers, it always felt like part of what one did. For some reason, I have no idea why, but it always felt like an essential part of it was to have someone to work with someone. I don't write collaboratively now, but I work with a lot of artists now. And I work with, composers. I have, composers and visual artists and filmmakers that I've worked with. So my first genre I worked in was fiction, because that's mostly what I was reading. And I just wasn't exposed to contemporary poetry. Like the only poetry I read in high school was Shakespeare or like, Wordsworth or something. And it just didn't seem like something you would emulate. It didn't seem like something that you could do. I mean, so I just emulated things that I read that I liked, that I read outside of school. And then I took a workshop. As an undergraduate, I was at UMass Amherst, and there was a poet there that I heard was like a famous poet, a famous living poet, which I didn't know really existed. It was James Tate. And someone said, "Oh, you should take a workshop with this guy." So I took a workshop with James Tate. He just exposed us to like all this beautiful contemporary American poetry. And that sort of like destroyed me for fiction. Really. Like after that, like I just realized that was more the way my mind worked, was the way poetry worked. So that sort of was the beginning of, so I consider myself primarily a poet, really. So even though I do
Oh,
other
that's so
genres, but
interesting. Yeah, I did not
yeah.
expect you to say that you started out writing fiction. That's an interesting trajectory.
Well, it wasn't good fiction. So
And
yeah.
And Courtney, what about you? Oh, it looks like you're muted.
Well done, Courtney. Um, well, I have some show and tell. It's exactly like Nick said. I started off writing what I was reading, light plagiarism, light, right? So here are my first oeuvres, right? These are when I was 6 and 7 years old, and they're
Oh,
made
those
with
are amazing.
wallpaper, and I'm such an egomaniac. I put excerpts on the back, and some of them have about the author sections. This one has an excerpt, a very French thing to do, right? And they're all just rip-offs of either Alice in Wonderland or Roald Dahl or Shel Silverstein. I I was really into poetry as a young kid. I loved the cadence. Um, and I was a big piano player when I was a little girl. So I wrote when I was really young, short stories, rip-off poetry from Shel Silverstein, and then songs. I was really into songwriting for quite a while, into my teenage years. And then in high school, I did mostly short stories. And then when I got to college, um, two things happened. I ended up majoring in comparative literature. So like Reyes, translation was a big part of my life and my major. I chose French to English translation. But I also started journalism. Let me put that in scare quotes, journalism in college, writing for the Providence Phoenix in Providence I was on the music beat, which makes no sense because I'm not actually, anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm not a huge fan of live shows for some reason, but and then I started working at Maxim magazine, which back in the 90s was like it was kind of a hot place to work, but not so hot for a woman. It was like Playboy light, right? And then I moved to France after college and continued translating. And I went over there with no green card, and I had all these under the table translation jobs, but I couldn't get an apartment on my own without like a visa. So long story short, it is a long story, but I will just say I ended up getting hired by Corona, the beer, as a party promoter. And so my job for 3 years was to just go out at night in a Corona mobile and like throw parties for this beer that no one wanted to drink. So I had a lot of free time during the day, and I had a short story, and it got longer and longer and longer, and that ended up being my first novel. Oh wait, I said it. So my first book was literary fiction, but like in my mind, I think of it as commercial fiction because, as you'll see as I go on, I pivoted to the indies a little bit. Why this was Simon and Schuster, so that was a novel. My second book, novel, and then perhaps we'll touch upon this today. But although it's a massive privilege, a true fortune, right? A good stroke of luck to publish with the big five or big four, big three, whatever the hell they are today. I found it really stressful because the more money they pay you, the more they expect your books to actually sell. There are these expectations. I found the whole thing privileged experience, but stressful. And so for my third book, I pivoted genres. I pivoted to working with independent presses, Tin House in this case. And this is historical fiction. It even has illustrations in it. So I think it was branded as experimental. And then I was like, this is a crazy industry and there's no user manual. So I'm going to write a user manual. So my fourth book was, it's reported nonfiction, right? A guidebook to the industry. And then my last book was memoir, going all over the place. I'm working on a novel now, but I will say for all these books that I'm holding up that were actually published, pretty much every genre but sci-fi is in a closet behind me. I spent the last 2 years trying desperately to write a thriller. I like challenging myself and trying to really write in many different genres. And I'm going to leave the thriller to the thriller writers. I can't do it. So much respect to crime and thriller writers, cannot pull it off. I think I have some erotica in me down the line, but sci-fi probably not because I don't know if I'm good at world building, but yeah, I think that's a snapshot.
Yeah, no, I love you took us through all of them. So that moment when you decided to make a pivot, what was that like? Was it something like you said you've been
Yeah.
you're always kind of challenging yourself, or was there any pushback or personal
Um,
otherwise?
yeah. Well, I mean, it's a complicated question to answer. My agent wasn't thrilled. I've done all these books with the same agent, and she's an incredible agent in that she stuck with me for all these different genres and scopes of books. That's pretty rare, quite honestly. Um, but she was like, I have to tell you monetarily and for your brand, this is a huge risk. You're pivoting in tone, you're changing houses, you're changing scope, all this stuff. But um, I just I don't know. I needed a challenge. So I also have I left this out. I have many, many decades of copywriting in my background. And for most of these books, I was copywriting on the side. And to me, it felt like I loved my first two books. I was very proud of them, but I wanted to try something new. And I felt that if I didn't, I would be copywriting. I would be copywriting for the man, right? I'd be copywriting for Penguin Random House. I wanted to, quite honestly, follow my heart. Looking back now, I wouldn't have done any of this differently. But I will say, just because I think that it's sort of our duty as people who have published to tell the truth to the people coming after us. I will say that I would be in a better financial situation. I would be much more comfortable financially if I had stayed in my lane, and stayed with writing kind of summer book club type books, again, of which I'm really proud, but it's a range and it's a tonality that I like to revisit. I'm working on that kind of book right now. But the only way I can do what I think of as commercial fiction is by getting super feral and doing art projects that earn me practically no money. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was a risk, but it didn't feel like a risk to me because I was just so happy to be doing exactly what I wanted with no compromise, in a format like I was really excited about Tin House. We did a small book. They never had problems with illustrations, whereas we had to, because of my contract, we had to show this to, at that point it was Putnam, because it was a book of fiction. I had to show it to my regular editor. But I knew that it just wouldn't sit with their catalog. And the minute they found out that there were illustrations in it, they freaked out. They were like, is this young adult fiction? Is it a graphic novel? Like, it blew their minds. And I will say that I've been very lucky. I've had amazing experiences at all these different publishers, but if you're excited about an old school relationship between an editor and a writer, you're more likely to find it at the smaller presses. There's less money on the table, and so the editors seem to have a lot more time. And I will say that with this book in particular, Costa Alegre, which is supposed to be written as a diary, but it's the diary of a woman who's in Mexico surrounded by people from all the exiled surrealists from World War II. So there's tons of different languages, snippets of many different languages. And just to finish with an example of how arty and almost romantic my relationship was with my editor, we had an hour-long conversation one day, because again, it's supposed to be a diary. And Maisie, my editor, was like, what are we going to do about the foreign phrases, though? Because from a copy editing standpoint, they should be in italics, but it's a diary and you would never write in italics. We spent an hour going back and forth and we were like, we can't use italics. And then the copy editor was like, you cannot not use italics. So yeah, just a funny anecdote.
Wow. Yeah. So this is a perfect pivot back to Reyes, who's published both books with smaller presses. Well, I've a two-part question. I'd love to just hear your experience about with the presses you've worked with, but also to the topic of the panel, if once you put out the short story collection, did you feel like, oh, I've been successful in fiction, this should be the path that I pursue? Or did you already have your poetry collection ready to send out? Were you sending it out at the same time? What did that feel like for you to be successful publishing in one genre and then think about pursuing publication in another?
Yeah. So yeah, I sent out the book of short stories, and then it got picked up. But then around the time it got picked up, that's when I was already working on my book of poetry. And then now the book of poetry is out. It's actually the book of short stories actually got me some pretty good attention. So now I have an agent, and now I'm working on a book of essays and throwing that out there. And so it's just been a really cool experience of working with these different presses and editors. And I've always been, I guess, fortunate where my first book of short stories was actually I'd submitted that to I don't know how many places, never got picked up. But then Rigoberto Gonzalez, who's a legend, he became head of a press or an imprint at University of Arizona Press, and he just reached out to me. He's like, "Hey, do you have anything?" I'm like, "Yeah," and he goes, "All right, we'll take it." And then Hub City Press, my book of poetry, I submitted that to I don't know how many places, didn't win anything, never picked up anything. But then a year later, Hub City Press is like, "Hey, is that still available?" Because they made it a finalist for one of their contests, and I was like, "Yeah," and they're like, "All right, we'll take it now." And then again, like the first book, then the attention of the first book then is getting me to my third book. And so it's in my experience, it's actually been really cool to kind of work on different projects. I don't like to get bored, and so if I get frustrated with one project, then I'll just work on something else. And so with each of these presses, they've gotten me different, I guess, levels of attention, where it's like my first book was from a university press in Arizona, whereas my second book is with an independent press out of South Carolina. Next might be New York, and it's kind of like I like to think that my work, wherever box or context you put it in, it's going to be good, and so that's how much I believe in the writing. That's what I told my agent. I'm like, like if you put my book in front of anyone, and if they give it a chance, I think they're going to like it. And that has just held true for me. It's gotten me into other spaces where now I write. I do curatorial work, and so I do curatorial writing. I do art criticism, and that's gotten me in some places. And so I think for me, what's always held true is just I love writing, and I think the love for that writing will show through. And I think audiences and people who pick up my stuff, I think, are going to feel that love. And I think presses wherever also feel that too. And so I think in due time, you just kind of find your people. And I think, I don't know that I usually have a hard time answering like questions directly, but I think that answers your
Well, that was
question.
perfect. Yeah, thank
Yeah.
you. And Nick, I'd love to hear about your experience. You've worked with, I feel like, presses of all sizes, but also I'd love to hear about your experience of, being successful in one genre, and then did it feel like a risk doing something different?
Yeah, it's hard to say. My first books were poetry, a couple books of poetry, but from the first book of poetry, I got a contract to do a nonfiction book, to do my first nonfiction book. So I was working on like 3 books at once. They all took a long time to finish. And so like the success of the book of the poetry, the success, whatever the success was, it didn't feel like a risk to jump over to nonfiction, just because that's like, it's a bigger press and stuff. So it didn't feel like a risk in that sense, just a risk whether it would fail or not, whether I could land it, I could land the book. And I just took a lot of time to do it. It took me 7 years to do it. I got the contract after like probably 4 years. and then I took another 3 years to finish it. So yeah, that's the thing. Just taking my time just to do it. Seems like the all I would suggest is just sort of like just give it whatever time it needs, and there's no rush for any of this. And also, like Reyes just said, like, work on different projects at once always works for me also, just to have like, you know, not that I get bored, but uh just that the project usually needs to sit for a while without me looking at it for a couple months. And so in that time, I'll just sort of work on something else and then come back to the other project. So yeah, that's yeah. I don't know if I'm answering your question either, but
Yes,
it
thank
seems
you.
like
And I love that you brought up that concept of working. I was going to ask you all if you work on different projects. I have a couple part question, but I want to talk about the idea of like themes in your work and themes that show up kind of no matter what you're writing. And Nick, I'm especially interested to hear from you on this because I know you put out the book Stay, which kind of groups your work from different genres and different themes. And I would just love to hear about that project and the process of putting it together, and what insights it gave you. I'd love to hear what perspective does each approach offer when you're kind of coming to the same topic?
what's the difference, like writing something as a poem or as a play or as nonfiction, you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the book Stay was a project I've been trying to get someone to do for a long time, for about 10 years. And but I needed like, it was sampling work from, these other three presses that I worked with. And they all had to agree to like let that stuff be published in one book that wasn't theirs. But they never really got it, because also, like Courtney said, like it was a book that would have images, it would have, a lot of other people in it. And so it was just really sort of it just didn't fit into what people would want to do. But then once the book started coming together, both the presses were like, why aren't we doing this? Like, and I was like, well, I offered it to you 10 years ago and you didn't want to do it. So, but I found like what I found interesting was, especially with memoir, like nonfiction stuff, I really think it's interesting to see like an image that sort of sticks in your subconscious that maybe comes from your, I imagine this is true for fiction too. I really don't write much fiction. I dabble. I'm on the edges of fiction. There's like fictional stuff that sort of seeps in, but it's not really. I don't exactly understand fiction in a certain sense. But just because life itself is just so strange, I can't imagine like making it up. It's like I would just go off the rails if I just made stuff up. Like I need to like really be grounded in something. So, but I have like the same image in like in my first book of poems, probably in a couple books of poems, my first play, and my first memoir. There's the same image of my father in that, putting himself, he was homeless for many years, and there's an image of him putting himself into a trash bag at night in order to keep the snow off him in the city. And it appears in each of the books. And it appears that it's a very, deep image for me that, that is hard for me to understand. And so if I present it in these different modes, a different energy is released, and I can see it differently. It's almost like turning something around, like making it into a three-dimensional object and looking at it from different angles and trying to understand it. Trying to sort of get a grip on this image. So, and I don't feel that it's like, I feel like it's such a central image for me that it makes sense to that it would appear in different places. It's like a dream image. Like, I don't know about your dreams, but in my dreams, the same places, I keep returning to the same places. I keep going back, and I'm just like, why am I in this house again that I didn't live in, I lived in like 20 years ago. Why am I back in this house? Like it happens all the time. And I think just as an artist, I think we should just trust that. We should just trust whatever images rise up in our subconscious, and trust that there's some meaning to it, that our job is to understand them. And so putting them through the different mediums, the different genres, just allows you to sort of get a deeper understanding of it. So
I like the idea, what you said about energy release. It releases a different energy. That's so interesting.
Well, I can
Courtney,
say just to jump on just an example of it. When I made that image into a play, of someone putting himself in a trash bag. In a play, you don't have to describe it at all. You just have the person do it on stage. It's just a stage direction, and then the audience is then filling in the language. So it's a completely different energy. Rather than writing actually that this is what's happening, the person just doing it on stage, which is very different. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, Courtney, what are your thoughts on the kind of connecting themes
Yeah.
and what different approaches offer?
Such a good question. And it would be very hard to answer if someone hadn't answered it for me. Um, for my memoir, which came out in 2022, I had always wanted to be invited on the podcast Between the Covers by David Naiman. I think it's just one of like the best, long form podcast, delving into authors' work. And the really special thing about that podcast, which David does out of Portland, is that he reads all of the authors' books in order. So it's not just promoting, one new book. He reads all of their books. And I got the news I was going to be on it. I was just overjoyed. And also I thought, oh, he's going to find the DNA, between all of these books that feel so disparate. And sure enough, right after his intro, he said something like, okay, so Courtney, all of your books are about art making in America. And I was like, holy shit. Yes, they are. I was like, oh my God, my whole life is going to be easier now because I see the connective tissue. Like he showed me myself, and I have thanked him for this, but I got to thank him again because it actually helps me with my Substack and everything. It's even in my bio, I am deeply passionate about trying to protect the feral art witch art making instincts while also trying to keep a roof over your head and buy $12 milk, all that stuff. I unfortunately think in America that the two need to live together. Capitalism and art are odd, uncomfortable bedfellows. But this is the country we're in for now. And when he told me that, I just, first of all, it's true. It should have seemed really obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me. It wasn't obvious to my agent, who had said things like, oh, I mean, how are we pitching your next book? What is this motley family that you're creating? But ever since then, so that was 2 years ago, I've had a lot more confidence about, I don't think anymore, and I certainly don't talk anymore about my work as like, oh yeah, and then I changed completely and I did this totally different thing. Now I'm like, I just chose a different register. I chose a different vehicle, storytelling vehicle. I chose a different publisher, whatever. But the stories that I'm battling with, the truth I'm trying to find, they are the same in every book. They really are about making beauty and art and staying true to your inner artist while struggling with the raging capitalism, consumerism, and over consumerism in America specifically. A lot of my books take place abroad, or they have people of different backgrounds and nationalities in them, but there's always a very American sensibility, a very American quest to understand what the hell the American dream is and why it's become, well, it's clear to me why it's become such a nightmare. But yeah, so
Yeah.
thank you, David Naiman.
That's so interesting. And that's so cool. I want that
Yeah,
experience.
everything. I hope anyone who's writing different genres, try to get on Between the Covers so that
Yeah.
David can tell you what you're doing with your life.
And I did not necessarily expect there to be a connecting thread to the very practical guide that you wrote, but there very much is. It's very central to your project overall.
Yeah, that's probably my truest memoir, even though I have an actual memoir, and that book is reported has hundreds and hundreds of other people's stories in it. You know, at the end of my life, that will probably go down as like, I don't know, my memoir, because it's what matters to me the most.
Oh, that's so interesting. And Reyes, what about you? What about the themes that are connecting all of your work? What are the different approaches offering to that?
Yeah. For me, I think all my projects, and whether it be the book of short stories, the book of poetry, the book of essays I'm working on now, the art criticism and curatorial project I'm working on right now. I think what they're all getting at is how one navigates language, particularly of American languages, or and so there's like the literal level, right? There's like English, Spanish, Spanglish that's happening through a lot of my works, but then there's also the language of a nation, right? Like what language are we actually speaking when, let's say, we're in America, right? And what is not part of that language, what is part of that language, and then also the language of expectations, right? Where it's like in the book of short stories, the first story features a family of pro wrestlers. And pro wrestlers have their own languages, right? They have like do you know what avalanche suplex is, right? Uh, Versus by the end of the book, that book, there's a zombie apocalypse, and so the zombie genre has its own language, right? It has its own tropes, it has its own notes to hit. But then you get to the poetry. Poetry has its own language in terms of expectations, right? When you say like, oh, this is a sonnet, right? That's like, it's a language, right? It's like, do you speak that particular language? Do you know what it is? And so the book of essays then looks at like American tropes, like what is an American, and throughout all these books, like Houston just shows up just ever so much in my work because Houston inhabits so many languages and spaces and histories that I think encapsulates so many of these experiences that I don't think anywhere else can really feature them. And so for me, the common themes is like, what is a nation? How does one at its bottom navigate it? And ultimately, what if you were to give someone at the bottom of this nation the ability to change it or to speak on it, what would they say? And I think that's what all my works get at. And I think for me, poetry lets me kind of play with the truth. I guess poetry lets me explore the truth, whereas fiction lets me play with the truth, and then nonfiction lets me deconstruct the truth. And so I think each of these modes and genres lets me kind of interact with language, where it's like, okay, a line is different than a sentence. The expectations of a line are different than the expectations of a sentence. And so how do I play with that? How do I encourage that? How do I clash that? And all that good stuff.
Yeah, that's so interesting. There's like a connecting thread between all of you, and that, there's a meta thing happening in your work, which I think lends itself to not sticking in one genre, because you're all interested in art making and language, on a very like fundamental level of, and I love what you said about expectations. I hadn't thought about that in terms of that exact way, but that's very interesting. So I think
Could I just jump in and say I just love what Ray's just said about the truth, that I'm trying to write it down. Like, was it poetry, you play with the truth, and fiction, you investigate the truth, and nonfiction, you reconstitute the truth? Is that what you said?
something like that. No, I think I said
I might have got it
poetry
wrong.
is to explore the truth.
Explore.
Fiction is to play with it, and then nonfiction is to deconstruct it.
Yeah, that's nice. I'm gonna borrow that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was very well said. Thank you. And thank you for asking him to repeat that, Nick, so we could all write it down. So Nick, I'd love to hear from you kind of like if we get into a more practical, like skill set sort of frame of mind, are there different craft components that you feel like apply to everything you write? Do you feel like you have to turn on different like craft skills or use different skill sets for different genres? And what are those?
Sure. I mean, like, like I said, I'm primarily a poet. That's why I approach everything as poetry. But my first memoir, my editor at Norton, who had bought the book, and then had to wait a couple of years before I actually got her a draft of the book. So I only gave her 40 pages, and then it took me a while to pull together an entire book. And when she got the when she got the full initial draft of the manuscript, it was horrifying to her because it was basically just like poetic scene after poetic scene, like lyric impulse after lyric impulse. It was completely unreadable, really, in that case, because it's akin to eating too much cake. It's like really good. A little bit's really good, but too much will make you sick. And so I had to figure out how to like create like this narrative connective tissue that would ground the reader in between these lyrical moments, to have that. And so that's the thing I think for nonfiction, the difference between nonfiction and poetry. You can, book of poetry is short, you're sort of in and out of it. Most books of poetry you can sit down and read in about an hour, and have an experience with it. Whereas, a nonfiction book, you're in it for a longer haul. And you do have to have this balance between the lyric and the grounded, in order to allow the tension of the thing to keep going and not to have it overwhelmed by the lyric impulse. If that's your inclination, which is my inclination, is to just sort of have it more lyrically driven. So I had to learn that. I had to learn how to do that. And I think that's a good, I talk about that with my students too, like how to sort of get that balance of the expository that isn't like just sort of like dumping information on someone, but has its own energy, its own like reason to be there. And it's not just to like sort of like just to dump information on the reader that they need to know, but it becomes an experience in itself, like they're reading that stuff. But it is of a different texture than the lyrical stuff too. It does have a different texture to it. So yeah.
Oh yeah, that's so interesting. Where did you turn to learn those
Oh,
skills?
I mean, like Ray said, like a lot of initial writers that I love were initially writing like journalism and stuff. And journalism, you have to do that. You have to get that, just get the facts down. And usually, I would notice like when I read like a long read piece that's sort of like giving you a lot of information. I find like near the end of the piece is where the writer sort of allows themselves to go like sort of deeply into speculation and lyric impulse, and they'll sort of try to sort of like have a poetic moment near the end, somewhere like in the second to last paragraph or something will be. So it's interesting. That'll sort of distill the entire whatever they're dreaming about into that, with the rest of it was just leading up to that. I'll notice that. So it was just reading closely, like reading other people closely that did it, that seemed to be able to do it. So yeah.
Oh, amazing. And Courtney, what about you? What are the skills that you bring to everything, and what are the skills you had to beef up for different genres?
I mean, honestly, the number one skill I bring to everything is just doggedness and determination. Like I don't give up, and I have really good time management. But in terms of each genre, for me, I think fiction, the big challenge is deciding on the length of the runway. Sometimes people think that their novel has to be much longer than it actually needs to be, or perhaps they think it needs to be much shorter than it needs to be. So having some sense of what length of runway is the right one for a novel specifically. I'm not going to talk about short stories because I don't think I excel at them, but and then with novel writing, momentum is the hardest thing. I like to use the word momentum instead of plot, because plot sounds static and I don't like the word. Whereas momentum, it is exactly what it sounds like, right? How are we keeping up the pace? Why is someone turning the page? It can be because of plot elements. Perhaps it's the beauty of the language. Usually there's something that we're trying to figure out or answer for ourselves. So yeah, the correct length for the project, and then how you're keeping up momentum are the big challenges for me personally in novel writing. In memoir, I think the question becomes about the first question that I'm confronted with is how am I structuring this, right? Because it's about memories. It's rare, it's pretty rare, unless it's a blog or something that you're reading a memoir in real time. The things you're writing about are in the past. I mean, and especially in publishing, they're going to be in the far, far past. Even if I wrote a book in one night, it's still, even with like an academic press, is probably not coming out for a year and a half, right? So memoir is always in the past. So structurally, how are you organizing your memories? If you're flitting back and forth in time, how are you doing that? You know, so I think the question of structure is a big, big one in memoir. And then equally important, if not more important, but this is a couple drafts in that this question presents itself, is how are you making the ultra personal and ultra intimate public? You know, generally you have to find some bridge toward a reader who knows nothing about you, perhaps didn't go through whatever it is you're writing about. How are you making the hyper personal universal? Because especially in the market today with memoir, if you want to have, if you want to be traditionally published, it is going to be challenging as a debuter to have just a hyper personal memoir that's so closed in on itself that it almost feels like a diary. Honestly, that's just revision, 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 finding your way toward a shared experience with your reader. And then nonfiction, I think it becomes a question of who you're letting into the room of the book. Nonfiction generally includes journalism and reported material, other people's experience. I mean, hearsay, memes, pop culture, right? You could bring all types of things in, but you can bring everything. And so what are you letting out? You know, only so many people and resources can fit on the arc. So I do think with nonfiction, the question becomes, what am I bringing in terms of outside material, and how will I seamlessly move between whatever the storyline and the narrative is, and then my kind of backup players, you know, when's the cello coming in, when's the cello shutting up, when are we using voice? That, to me, the only way I know how to do that, really the only way I know how to teach it, is close reading, like Nick said, reading, reading, reading with a highlighter, especially for reported memoir, hybrid memoir, straight up nonfiction. You got to get in there, and I would highlight when we're bringing in historical research. I'd highlight when we're bringing in pop culture, use all different colors, and then you can train yourself visually through the colors of the highlighters to understand the cadence of the book you want to try to write. That's my best
That's
advice.
incredibly practical with the different colors. That's an interesting exercise. Reyes, what about you? What are the skills that you're bringing across genre, and what are the skills specific to the different genres you're writing?
I mean, in terms of skills, I mean, I'm not entirely sure, I guess. Like, I think I kind of just more look at it like what's the most fun in what context. So, like in poetry, like in my book of poetry, I have a poem that's in the shape of like a turtle shell. Like, I don't think you like that's just something I don't think you can do in fiction. Like, you can try, but it's just probably not going to be as approachable. I have a poem in the shape of a map of a flea market. But then in the short book of short stories, I have a short story that's set on Mars, that's mimicking the style of a Supreme Court document, you know. And so, and then the essays, I have an essay that's in the form of a syllabus. So it's just kind of like it's whatever is the most fun. It's whatever for me is like what do each of these forms let me tap into, what interests me the most. And so I guess in terms of skills, it's like the essays, for example, will go more into like the journalistic, the analytical, but also the humorous, the, you know, what forms do I understand and how do I deconstruct them and play with them. The poetry will be more of like at the atomic level, where it's like, oh, what happens if you put the adjective after the noun, or like in Spanish, or what happens if you reverse the order of the words, or what if you put like, but then like a short, like a fiction, how far can a sentence go? What can you make the sentence do that still kind of maintains the reader's attention? For example, I think there's a novel, I forget who wrote it, but it's like the whole novel is just sentences. Like it's just one sentence after another.
Is it
And
Paget
like,
Powell?
yeah, exactly. And it's kind of
Mm.
like, that's cool, but no offense to him, but I'm not going to read that whole thing, but you can have a whole book of poetry where each line is a question, because I think that's just more like approachable. That's more like you can probably take that on more. So, but I don't know, that to each their own. But I think like for me, it's navigating like what is most fun for me and what I think will be most fun for the reader. Because I think ultimately that's just what I want out of the experience, is like, oh, how are we gonna like both look at this thing together? You've trusted me with your time and your attention, and this is what I'm going to give you. And you'll come back for more, I bet, And so, yeah, I guess in terms of skills, like a nameable skill, it would be, how am I communicating with the people that I want to talk to, right? Like, how am I giving you the energy that if I were to go to a friend, like, yo, I just saw this thing that's really cool, let me show it to you, except I'm doing it to someone who may be, yeah, in Portland, who's never met me in their entire life, and they just saw this book that happened to be colorful on the shelf, and they pick it up, and now they know me. I like to think that's kind of maybe the skill that I'm going to that I'm tapping into.
Yeah, and just playfulness, it sounds like, ingenuity. Um, I love the idea of like leading with an interesting form, and what's going to be, even leading with the question of what's going to be fun is interesting, and exciting. Okay, so I have one last question I'm going to ask y'all from me, and then we'll dive into the Q&A. What are the non-writing activities that you all do that feed your creativity? Nick, I know you're really involved. You are a visual artist. Your collages are incredible. I'd love to hear about how that feeds your writing, and what other activities kind of feed your creativity.
Oh, I think, everything else in my life is what feeds my writing. I try to do just, I mean, there's some things that I have to do, I guess, but there's not much that I have to do that I don't get something from. I mean, I had to like, talk to a plumber this morning and, have a pipe removed, a gas pipe removed from the house. And I thought that was just fascinating. It was just great, like talking to this guy. Uh, so I can't think of anything that doesn't somehow couldn't feed the writing in some way. But as for like practices, like, yeah, I do have a collage practice that I've had for like, since my early 20s. And it is something I go to when I'm not writing, which is quite often I'm not writing. And uh, it is a way to sort of organize like, you know, images that don't really make sense to me, that they're not like sort of just like collages of like, colors or patterns or something. They're collages of images, usually from like film stills or photographs, or and they're just sort of like juxtaposed in order to create some sort of a narrative that is just out of reach, that doesn't really exactly make sense. And I did use those for my last book for Low. I used those collages as like probably 3/4 of that book is based on those collages. Writing a poem off of the collages. Uh, and it did, again, that just sort of was another way of sort of going into language, and sort of like also, you know, it all led back to the same places in my subconscious, but it was a new way in. There were like new routes into the subconscious that were surprising to me. Like I didn't know why, like I would put these images together, why I gathered them. And then once I sort of sat and started writing, there was some glimmer of some meaning that I could sort of like approach with them. So that was fun. That was really fun to do. And I'm not, I haven't made a collage in a little while, a few months, I guess, but, I'll probably get back into it in the fall. So that's like, that is sort of one of the modes right now. But I also do other things. I work with a band. I have a band. I make music. I I've worked with a filmmaker. I'm doing a project with a filmmaker. There's also, yeah, all sorts of these art projects that I do that I just sort of like say yes to if I like the people, if it's someone I like to work with. There's very little financial gain to any of these things, except it's just sort of really fascinating to me. It's just really fascinating to see how another artist works and to sort of try to see what if I applied what they're thinking to the writing, how would that change the writing? Anyway, I did I was the writer in residence, the artist in residence for a performance and technology lab in Toronto for the past year. And we worked on an AI project, this sort of large scale AI project. And that was just fascinating. Like suddenly, I started doing it before the whole Chat GPT got released. And so I was sort of, in this other realm. So Chat GPT didn't scare me. I've never used Chat GPT, but we were using like other programs, a different kind of program. And I found it just fascinating just as a technology, as a tool to like stimulate, just to see the world in a different way. I thought it was fascinating. So.
Yeah, I loved hearing the origins of your collaboration. Like from the very beginning, you were collaborating with friends on writing, and you've really stayed true to that. And I feel like a lot of writing is a conversation, so it's just really cool to hear. Courtney, what about you? What are the non-writing activities feeding your creativity?
I mean, it's similar to Nick, like everything feeds my creativity. In fact, I need help finding activities where I shut the writing brain off because it's just too much with me. I mean, I can't do anything like I drive around podcasts, the ads in the podcasts, the way that the people sell the mattresses, try to sell you the Helix mattress, the stuff on the cereal box my kid is eating, it's just storytelling is omnipresent, it's everywhere, and that's amazing, and I love that. But so I write films with my husband. He's a filmmaker, so I do a lot of screenplay writing and stuff, but that's not getting away from the writing. The one activity that really plugs me back in and nourishes me in terms of energy is I work with horses. Pretty obsessed with horses. I spend every day, almost every day, doing something with a horse. And that to me is like the number one thing that keeps me going because it shuts down the writing and thinking brain. Number one, it's a dangerous activity. So I can't multitask. Even when I'm on a horse, I can't be thinking of my work. I really need to just stay present. And I've tried meditation and yoga and all these things. And it's only horseback riding that allows me to truly empty my mind and focus on just one thing. It's the only place in my life I'm able to do that. I'm certainly not doing it when I'm asleep. I'm a terrible sleeper. So that's it. Even though it's the one place in my life where I'm not thinking about writing, I'm not solving problems like at all.
But you need
It's
that
how I
practice.
recharge. It's how I recharge and manage to restore the energy to apply to all the other things that I do.
Yeah, and it was a joy to read about in your
Oh,
memoir.
thank you. Yeah, my memoir is about the special relationship between horses and women and the patriarchy's attempt to tame both parties over time or historically. Yeah.
Reyes, what about you?
What was the question?
What are the non-writing activities that feed your creativity? I'd love to hear more about your art curating.
Yeah, so that's one thing I love, art, visual art, um, especially Houston art. I think Houston in general is just kind of like a slept on a major city in terms of what it has to say about being an American and art and literature. But yeah, like I'm curating a virtual exhibition called The Houston Artist Speaks Through Grids. That where I kind of juxtapose or put in conversation different artworks by different Houston artists that use grids in their artwork. And it was just kind of like a pattern that I started to realize. And it's like, oh, what are we actually saying? Particularly artists of color in Houston, grids as an institutional kind of form of violence and how it's, put upon people, and how do we kind of play with that image? How do we play with the expectations of the grid? And that then leads to the writing. I love beer. I love visiting different breweries. And that also kind of became a writing practice. And I'm writing like a book of like beer poetry reviews. I mean, I love writing, so everything kind of feeds the writing. I think writing is just like the funnest thing. And so I like beer. Started even making my own wine. So I recently went to Fredericksburg and I got some peaches from there. So I made some peach wine. Um, I love hiking, uh, different contexts. It all feeds into it. I mean, I recently just got like some dental work done. I mean, that kind of feeds the writing of navigating insurance and pain, and doing that then led me into like a rabbit hole of research of like under medication of pain medications, to certain groups. So, it all feeds into the writing. But movies. I love watching movies. Especially looking at how different artists, might tackle the same issues that I'm tackling, and how are they incorporating that into their language and their practice. So I'm always trying to be inspired by how different people navigate the same truths that I'm navigating.
I just feel like there's this overall sense of experimentation with all of you, and you're just kind of open to different influences and different ways of seeing and approaching things. That I think is just really a cool way to not pigeonhole yourself and to not box yourself in, as to go back to the title. But so thank you all for answering my questions. Let's see what the Q&A has in store for us. Courtney, this one's for you. Or I think you'd have a good answer for this one. Do you recommend staying with your brand and in your lane, or straying and doing what you feel you need to do?
I mean, can really only answer that for myself. Also, I wanted to thank you, Sarah, for your really great questions. I mean, there's a couple different ways to answer that, right? Like if you're writing something that's so wildly different from something you've already published, or how people know and recognize you, or perhaps it's a bit polemic or too revealing or something, there are pen names, right? You can write under a pen name. I never considered doing that. It just seems like a lot of upkeep. Like you have to have all these different social media handles. It's just a lot to juggle. I try to keep my life as streamlined as possible. It's not very streamlined, but yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, for better or for worse, this is sort of a question about success. Because if you start having success in one genre, especially the higher up on the ladder, the more you're getting paid, right? If you're up there with the big 5 publishers and you've had success writing, I don't know, a kind of comedic, like a rom-com, your people are going to want you to keep doing that, right? Like, I don't know, you have a ramen restaurant, people want you to keep making ramen. They love your ramen. People are lining up around the block. So, I got to a point, I literally could not put out another bowl of ramen. I had to have salad. So yeah, sometimes you're gonna have to follow your heart. Sometimes you won't have a choice and you'll have to follow your pocketbook. I was very lucky for 2 things. Number one, my first book and my second book, I was paid really handsomely. The books sold in many foreign markets. They were optioned for films. They did well. And I'm also not a big spender. I'm careful and I'm frugal. So I managed to have some savings. But number 2, I had been working as a copywriter for big advertising agencies on the side while I was writing these books. So I was also still earning an income while I was writing those books. And I saved. I don't know how to invest, but I know how to not spend, right? So I had some real savings. So when I did the pivot, to the indies, I do think it's important to mention that I had about 3 years of savings. So I was schooled enough in publishing by that point. I knew, I mean, I think my third book, I got like $7,000, as opposed to six-figure book deals for the other ones, right? So like I wasn't, and this is paid over two installments over a year, 20% to the, right? Like you're getting barely anything. So if again, if you're having success and people start to expect something from you, you're going to need some grit, you're going to need some courage, you're going to need some good people around you, and you're going to need some savings. And then it does help to develop a place that your readers can find you, that's a general place, like the water cooler, where everyone can find you and you're not writing sci-fi or romance or nonfiction, you're just sort of being you, where you can gather an audience for people that just adore everything you do. So I know that we can complain about social media, but it can be a freeing channel because it doesn't, I mean, I have a Substack and I love doing my Substack, but it can be you making funny commentary while you're making dinner, right? It can be a TikTok. It doesn't have to be related to publishing at all. Maybe you're a huge fan of bird watching and you make really funny comments while you're watching the birds, and you can build up an audience around that. And then when you announce you have a book out, first of all, the people who buy books are usually not writers because we get each other's books for free. Like the writers are not always your best source for book buyers. They're people who just like you and think like, man, I thought he was just a bird watcher. I didn't know that he had a novel. That's so cool. I'm going to buy 5 books for my local bird watching chapter, right? So yeah, have some savings. Just in general, you're going to be an artist in America. You're going to need some frickin' savings. And number 2, have one place, you don't need to be in all the places, but have one place somewhere online where people can follow you and fall in love with you. Yeah,
That's great advice. Thank you. Nick, I feel like you'll have a good response for this question, and I'm going to combine these 2 questions. Someone asked, once you've written your memoir, are you not done with that genre? Therefore, you must find another if you still want to write. How many memoirs have you published at this point?
I've published 4 memoirs so far. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, and they could be, I guess they could be called something different than memoir, but I kind of like it's sort of perverse to just keep calling a memoir. Each one has, there's very deep nonfiction elements in each book. So they could have been, presented in different ways, right? I was sort of fine with the queasiness of just keep publishing memoirs. I think it's, I don't see any reason to have to change at all, or but each book, though, I mean, that's the thing, they're called memoirs, but each one is like really different than the other ones. Like each one has different subject matter, different tone, different structures. They sort of have a similar package, but each one is like, and there's even a different character of like Nick Flynn in each one. Like I always think that if you like the Nick Flynn in the first memoir, you probably won't like the Nick Flynn in the second memoir. Like it's and it's the same person, but it's just sort of it's how we do it. I just think also, like, I loved what Courtney said too. I mean, I was thinking of what Grace Paley said. What's the one thing that her one advice for young writers, and it was just 2 words. It was low overhead. Just to keep your expenses low, because you're going to need a lot of time and you're not going to make a lot of money doing this. And I think to go into any of this, especially, I mean, I began this as a poet, and, it's not something you go into thinking, okay, this is the big money maker. And even like anything, like it's, that I made money, the money that I made writing memoirs is completely unlikely, and not like, not to have been expected. So I always had to have a day job the whole time I had to sort of maintain a day job, just because I wouldn't want to depend on the art to be my source of income. That seems like putting too much pressure on the art, really. It seems like it's expecting too much from the art. The art is too quicksilver and uh, uh, just skittery to expect that it's going to actually support you. So I think it's important just to sort of, yeah, figure out your life, and then the art, figure out how much you can sort of give to the art, how much of it. And generally, if you're going to become an artist, it's more and more of your day gets turned over to the art. You try to figure out how to make money in less and less time, to pay the bills. Uh, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. And Reyes, if you could just bring us home with answering this one question quickly. When working on different projects, how do you commit to finishing them?
I like to have like a main project that I'm working on, and then kind of peripheral projects. So like right now, my main project is finishing this book of essays, but that doesn't mean I still also don't write poems. I just wrote a short story last week, while I'm researching and writing the book of essays. I have like 2 essays left, and so it's just one of those things of yeah, just juggling and just kind of following your interests and following your intuition on what you need at the moment as a writer, but also setting up different things that are fun for you, like the beer poems. Like I'll just go to a brewery, just like, oh, I just need a break from like, a structure. I'll just go to a brewery, have some beers, and write about what the beers inspire. So I think just kind of having fun, again, ultimately just setting up that schedule of yourself and the things of how writing can be fun for you. Ultimately, that's who you're accountable to, yourself, your art, your craft. The money, that's important, absolutely, but it's ultimately, you can make money any number of ways. There's easier ways to make money than writing. So if that's really your interest, then you can do tons of other stuff. But as long as you're dedicated to your craft and you love your work, and you want to talk to people, you want to talk to communities, and you love those communities, and you want to share your work with them, then follow that. And it hasn't led me astray. It's gotten me further than I could have ever expected. Writing didn't owe me anything, but it's given me everything I have. So yeah, just set yourself up to keep writing and to follow the things that you love.
Beautiful, well said. Well, I just want to thank you all so much for being here, for answering our questions, for being so open and honest and insightful. I love this concept of writing across genres. I think it really does ignite the playful side, the experimental side. It keeps things interesting. And you all are wonderful career models that we can follow. And so I'm just really grateful. Yeah, so with that, everyone out there, thank you so much for being here. Everyone on the Zoom, everyone joining us on YouTube. You could have been anywhere. We're so grateful that you joined us tonight. And please, please, please buy these incredible books. There's so many books to choose from, and they're all amazing. You will not be disappointed. So definitely check out our panelist books, and thank you all for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, so much. Good night,
Thank
Reyes. Good night,
you.
Nick.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
y'all.
Yeah.
Having us.
Bye.
Goodbye,
Great to be
writers.
here.
Good luck,
Bye.
everybody.